Hey you guys, it's your host Julian. This week I sit down with Retake's director for King of the Hill, Dion. In this episode we'll chat about how he broke into the animation industry, some of his favorite episodes, some of the pranks that were pulled behind the scenes, and Glenn's going to share one of my favorite stories about them pranking the late great Ian Wilcox. If you haven't yet, you should check us out on Patreon. We're offering 3 tiers with a lot of fun perks. Some of those perks included in the 3 tiers are a special shout out to all the patrons, question priority, early and ad-free access to the audio and video chats, voting on our upcoming retrospectives, and so much more. Now, let's get on to my chat with the great Dion. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to What's in My Head podcast. I'm your host Julian. Today I'm joined by Glenn. Glenn, how are you, sir?
Doing great. Good to see you.
Man, absolutely. Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, man. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing our weeks-long chat now with King of the Hill with another person that's going to continue to add layers to the King of the Hill story. My favorite, I have told so many people this so many times, man, so I apologize, but King of the Hill, hands down, my favorite adult animated comedy of all time. It's probably my favorite adult show of all time. There's so much heart in here. There's so much soul. There's so much fun. I would love to know, man, you said you came on at season 3. So how does Glenn go from doing what he was doing before to working on King of the Hill?
I'll say this much. I got lucky on an absolutely inconceivable level. I mean, like literally, I can't stress enough how, and I've had people ask me like, well, how do I get into the industry? I'm like, I don't know, man, because I tripped about 15 times and landed on a primetime network show in my first job. So what happened was I was living in Seattle, Washington at the time, and I was selling shoes in a store downtown Seattle. So living the life. And I had met a guy, and again, lucky, I was looking for an apartment in Seattle. This would have been 1996, like early 1996. And I went to this apartment. This is back in the day when you just walked around and looked for signs that said vacancy. There was like no internet or anything like that. You just walked around. I was walking around Lower Queen Anne Hill in Seattle, and I saw a sign that said vacancy. So I went in and asked the manager. It was like, oh, I see there's a room. Can I check it out? And they're like, well, the previous tenant's still living there, but I'll check with him to see if it's okay. And they were like, he said, yeah, sure, come on in, take a look at the place. So I go in, the place looked like someone threw a hand grenade in there. It was just an absolute mess. And it turns out he was just moving upstairs. But the first thing I noticed is that he was an older guy, and he was sitting at a drawing table, specifically an animation table, with an animation disc drawing. Now, I had wanted at the time to be a comic book artist. I thought animation was sorcery that like only a select few who were part of some sort of blood pact were able to do. So it never even occurred to me to be like a thing that I could pursue. But I just saw him and I was like, oh, what is this guy doing? And she was like, here's the bathroom. I'm like, yeah, okay. And I'm just like, literally the place could have had mold and cockroaches, and I probably would have ended up taking it because as soon as the tour was over, it was a studio apartment. So the tour didn't take very long. As soon as it was over, I was just like, hey, I was like, what you doing there? And the guy's like, oh, I'm an animator. And we got to talking. He was at the time doing some freelance for like a video game for Microsoft or something. But when I got to talking to him, he was like a 30-year veteran of television animation industry, and he'd worked on Scooby-Doo back in the early 70s, Super Friends. He worked on G.I. Joe in the 80s. He'd worked on the movie Heavy Metal. So he's just laying down all these shows. And I was like, oh my God. And I told him, I said, well, yeah, I like to draw. I wanted to be a comic book artist and everything. He's like, oh, I've always wanted to do comics. And he's like, well, hey, I'm only moving upstairs. So if you take this place, we can just, compare notes. So I took the place, and then for like the next year and a half, he lived upstairs, and he taught me kind of animation. I taught him what I knew about comics at the time. I wasn't like a published comic book artist or anything, but I had been studying, comics for years, and I'd always been an avid comic reader. And what ended up happening was, because he didn't want to come back down here. He was from Seattle. He wanted to stay up there. But what happened was is that he had X number of years in the guild, the
Mhm.
animation guild, and he was short of being fully vested by like a ridiculous, like a couple, like 5 weeks or something like
Mhm.
that. Like he had to come down here and work in a guild at a guild job for like 5 weeks. He was in his early 60s at the time, so this was a major. It was a concern for him to have health insurance for the rest of his life, pension, things like that. And he's like, well, I have to do it. He had a friend at Sony Pictures Sony Animation, who was doing Men in Black, the Men in Black cartoon at the
Ooh.
time.
Mhm.
And so he moved down, grudgingly moved back down here. And he's like, hey, when you're ready, you let me know and you can come down, you can stay with me. I'll introduce you to people, whatever, the whole 9 yards, and I'll, try to get you set up. And I was like, okay, I'll keep that in mind. And then 6 months went by and things kind of progressed in Seattle to a point where I just decided I can't stay here anymore. I'm getting nowhere. I'm just on a hamster wheel. And something kind of came to a head where I'm just like, gotta go. And called him up and was like, hey, is that offer still standing? He's like, absolutely. And at the time that I called him, he was just coming off of a timing gig on The Simpsons.
Mhm.
And he lived a block from Film Roman Studios in North Hollywood. So made all the arrangements, gave the notice at my office, and got my little Mazda 323 and headed south. And I just drove down here, got to North Hollywood, and stayed with him. And I remember two things. The first day I was there, so I got there, and then like the next day, so the first full day I was there, he's like, hey, I have to go drop some freelance stuff off over at WB. And he had been doing freelance background designs for Batman Beyond, which was my favorite
Wow.
show. So we went, it was a Saturday, so there was nobody there, but he was just going in and just dropping some stuff off or whatever. And back in the old, manila envelope days,
Mhm.
you couldn't just upload something to the server. This was 1998. And so we go in, and I'm just in the studio, and I see the cubicles with all the model sheets up and people's personal drawings and storyboard panels. And then this is like my show. This is a show that I love. And that was my first experience in LA. I was just like immediately electrified. Like I could just feel like this energy coming off of everything. And like I just knew I had made the right decision. The Monday, the first, so 2 days later, that Monday, he walked me down to Film Roman, and I met this guy. His name was Jay Francis. He was the recruiter at the time for Film Roman, and I had my crappy portfolio, and went in and I talked to Jay, and I showed it to him, and I think he just wanted to know that I could draw. So he gave me a character layout test for King of the Hill, and he gave me a character design test, which I was like, all right, I hadn't really had any thoughts of doing design, but I was like, I'll take whatever or test he gives me. So I did them. Luckily, Paul had, discs and paper, and he had everything I needed, and he kind of helped me out and talked me through what I was supposed to do with it. And I remember it was a cut scene from, because I was already a fan of the show. I'd watched the first two seasons, was already a fan of the show. So I knew it pretty well. And it was a scene from the episode where Bobby was kissing the mannequin, where he got caught
Oh
kissing
yeah.
the mannequin. It was a cut scene. It was a scene that had been cut from that episode where Hank takes him to the mall to try to get him to talk to a real girl. And he takes him
Mhm.
into like a girl's clothing store. And he's like, there she is, Bobby. Go talk to her. So there's a girl who's like trying on dresses, and he goes over and then beelines over to a mannequin and starts talking to a female mannequin. It was a scene that never made it into the show, but I just remember thinking, it's like, oh, I know that episode. And so I did the test and I turned it in, and then just kind of didn't think anything else of it. And then
Mhm.
weeks went by, maybe even a month, because I moved there in like middle of February, and I had just gotten to a point after a while where I just didn't give it a single thought anymore because I hadn't heard anything back. And it was enough time that I was starting to get a little disheartened in general, not just about that, but just like, we had gone around and met a couple of people here and there, and nothing was really percolating yet. And I was like, oh, I hope I didn't make, the wrong choice moving down here, because I moved to LA sight unseen. I had never been here before. I had never worked in animation before.
Mhm.
But what I didn't realize at the time was that seasons 1 and 2 of King of the Hill were done in this weird, they were kind of trying to figure out their method. And they were done in this weird kind of storyboard hybrid layout thing where it was like, it wasn't pure storyboards. They were like slightly larger storyboards, but they weren't quite full layout, which is how The Simpsons did it. So Wes Archer, who was the supervising director, I guess he had a lot of experience. He'd worked on The Simpsons since the beginning, and so he understood like how full layout worked. And that season, I guess King of the Hill had done well enough and was doing well enough that they sort of approved shifting to full layout, just like The Simpsons did, which involved hiring a bunch of new people. And at the time, unlike now, there was kind of people were kind of at a premium. There was more jobs than there were people to fill them, and which is good because I wouldn't have gotten the job otherwise. And yeah, I remember specifically there was an ad in Animation Magazine. It was a full page ad, and it was Hank Hill doing the Uncle Sam routine, and he said, "I want you to draw me," and it was basically because they needed a bunch of people. I think they hired like 30 people or something like that, and I ended up being one of them. And it was April 6th, I remember, was my first day, and on April 3rd, I got a call from a woman named Stephanie, who it would end up being my boss for the next 11 years. And she's like, "Hey, you want to, this is, Stephanie over at King of the Hill. Do you want to start on Monday?" I was like,
Yes, I do.
yeah, yes. And I was like, I was about to go to Santa Barbara with my friend Paul to meet a friend of his up there. And I was kind of a little depressed about the trip. And then she called and she's like, "Here's how much it starts at." And I had just been selling shoes in Seattle, and so the number she gave me was all the money in the world. And I was just like, "You're kidding, you're going to pay me this for something I've been doing for free my entire life?" Sure. And yeah, so I hung up the phone and I told Paul, I was like, that was King of the Hill. They want me to start on Monday. And he's like, "Holy shit." And the trip to Santa Barbara was way more fun than I thought it was going to be because I had a job waiting for me. So yeah,
and that weight was lifted off your shoulders too. I mean, I got to imagine.
Well, it was a weight was lifted off and then a new weight was put on. It was like that episode of The Simpsons with the stone cutters where they're like, take off the stone of shame, put on the stone of triumph, and it was twice as big because now I had to actually perform. And and it was right down the street. So I walked. It was literally one block away from the apartment where I was staying with him. So Monday rolled around and I walked in and there were all these other scared people standing around because I forget how many of this there was that were starting that day. And that was luck phase number one. Luck phase number two was that since we were shifting to full layout, they gave us a week of training, which is unheard of. Like usually in animation, you got to hit the ground running and they don't care. They're just like, "Here you are, get to work." But luckily, they're like, "These idiots need training for a week," and they were right. And they threw us to poor Sean Cashman, who's been a guest on your show. Yes. And that poor guy had to train 3 classes worth of morons who didn't know what they were doing. And he was awesome. Sean is still a good friend of mine to this day. And him teaching us layout. And my week was short because it was Good Friday. So it was 5 4-hour days. And then I was in the last training week and it was 4 5-hour days. We still got the same amount of time. It was just condensed into 4 days. And so, yeah, he taught us layout. He explained just how to, everything, how to do comps, how to blow up the storyboard. And this is back in the day where you had the model packs with all the characters. And if you would figure out how big you needed the character to be, and you would take the model pack to the copy machine and you would blow it up or shrink it down to whatever size you would need. And then you would bring it back to your desk and you would use that as the point of reference. Nowadays, you just drag it into the software you're using and scale it up or down or whatever. So he's teaching us all of this stuff. And my head is, I'm just trying to absorb it all because I think if I forget one thing come Monday, I'm screwed. And the week was done and I was exhausted, even though it was only a 20-hour work week. And then Monday rolled around and we went in and we were given our assignment. I got lucky. Phase number 3 was that I got assigned. My first episode was called Good Hill Hunting. It was episode 4, but if you look at it on Hulu, it's like episode 8 or something. I do remember that Luann lost her hair in the Megalomart explosion. And the first 6 episodes of the season, her hair was gradually growing back. And then Fox reordered the episodes. and we had a different design for her hair getting progressively longer each episode. And then they reordered the first episodes, and we had to go back and redraw her hair in all of these different episodes to be them to progressively grow out. And I think that was the last time they ever did anything like that, where episode order air order mattered. So I
Did
got
they ever give a reason why?
no,
I
it's
don't
just
mean to cut you off.
Julian, don't ever question the network because you'll go
Got it.
insane trying to figure out why they do the things they do. Execs are not from this planet. They have their reasons. They don't share those reasons that we don't ask. We just
Goddamn aliens.
yes, sir, and we just do it. One of the first things I ever learned in this industry. But one of the other things I got super lucky with is that my very first episode, Good Hill Hunting, was directed by a guy named Clay Hall. And I think your last guest, at least the last guest that aired as of the time that we're recording this, Alan Jacobson, was my assistant director. And he was 2 years into the industry. And to me, he was this cagey, wily veteran who like had been in the trenches and like, this, I have to do everything this guy says. And which I did. And it was a good thing I did. But Clay was probably the best first director I could have gotten, because he was organized and he was focused and he was patient and he had a great assistant director. And it was just one of those things where, like, in hindsight, there were other directors that I worked with later, and I'm like, oh, if I'd gotten you, and there's nothing against them, not like, oh, I hate this guy, but like I could tell, like, oh, if I'd gotten this guy first, it wouldn't have gone as smoothly.
Yeah.
But Clay was just the guy. Like I was so glad I got him first. He just knew, like, I never had to, like, it was never stressful. There were a couple of directors where when you got them, you were like, oh, thank God. It's like you just knew, because like, I'm not going to be working nights and weekends because they're organized and everything. But Clay was one of those guys. I remember two things I remember my first day is one, my cube wasn't ready. So I had two first days. I had my first day of training, which was the week before, and then I had my first day on the job, which was the following week. And they didn't have a cubicle for me, so they put me in a room with a storyboard artist named Michael DiMartino. And anybody who knows animation knows who Michael DiMartino is. I didn't know who Michael DiMartino. Nobody knew who he was then. He was just a board artist on King of the Hill. And again, wily, cagey, veteran to me. And he could have been hired the day before for all I knew. But as far as I was concerned, this is the guy, this guy right here. And he gave me all kinds of like advice. I'm like, this is my first day in the business. And he gave me a bunch of advice, and he was super cool and super chill. And then I remember looking at his boards and I was like, what am I doing? Like, there's been a horrible mistake and they're going to realize this any second now. But yeah, he was just like really mellow, cool guy. And I was really glad that I was really glad that they didn't have a cube ready for me, because I got to like talk to this dude for the probably most of the day. And then at the end of the day, they were like, all right, we had a cubicle for you. But I was glad I had that little buffer and was able to talk to somebody instead of just being tossed into a cubicle and saying, go for it. But yeah, so I remember sitting at my new desk, and I remember having like a stack of animation paper and reading the script and listening to the track and just thinking to myself, I don't know what I'm doing, and they're going to realize I don't know what I'm going to do. And I was like, 2 weeks tops, and then I'm going to be back to selling shoes. And they're going to be like, wait, is there a guy named Glenn Dion, Deon? And we just hired the wrong dude. But I just, and one of the things, I grew up in the military. My dad was a career Air Force. We moved around a lot. And one of the things you learn is adaptability. You're living your life, and then all of a sudden someone says, guess what? Now we're going to uproot and we're going to move you over here, and you get to start all over again. And I did that enough times when I was a kid, making new friends, starting new schools, just constantly, that moving to new places and starting new things was just the norm for me. And this was just the latest move and the latest new thing that I was doing. But it mattered because this is all I'd ever wanted to do. I wanted to draw for a living in whatever form that took. And suddenly here I was sitting at this desk, and someone was going to pay me money to do it. And I was like, I can't. It was the first time in my life where I'm like, I can't screw this up. I'd had jobs before. I'm like, if I screw this up, who cares?
Yeah.
Pretty much every job I'd had up to that point. This is the first time where I'm like, I cannot screw this up. And I remember the first scene I ever worked on in Good Hill Hunting. It was it was a scene where Hank is at Strickland Propane, and Eustace, the guy that they used to make fun of that they went to high school with, he was there and he was trying to lift a propane tank, and he couldn't because he's a twig boy. And then Hank walks in and he's like, Hank, could you help me out to my SUV with this? And Hank, of course, grabs it with one hand and just picks it up like it's a paper cup. And I remember looking at the storyboards, and it suddenly occurred to me. I was like, and I got this idea, and luckily Clay's office was literally right outside my cubicle. And I stuck my head and I was like, hey, Clay, I was just thinking when Eustace, after Hank takes the tank, Eustace should like maybe rub his back or something, like it hurt. And Clay was like, okay. And then I went back. I'm like, I get to like have ideas and stuff and like do things and like add to this. And that was the first time it was my first day, and I got that realization that like I'm not just, doing this like mechanical thing, that I get to like add to the whole thing. And I think from then, it started to kind of roll a little bit more for me. And then I forget at what point I started feeling a little bit more comfortable with all of it. But I do remember it was about 2 weeks into the job, and my friend Paul, who I was living with, he had worked on The Simpsons the year before. And The Simpsons, for anybody who's ever worked on it or known anybody that worked on it, every third Tuesday they have a gigantic party at like Staples Center or who knows what. They were always known for like every time you turned around, they were having huge, premiere parties, and they were having huge Christmas parties or whatever. I think it's because Matt Groening owns The Simpsons. So he was just throwing parties for the crew left and right. And they were always like crazy blowout, insane parties. And I remember my friend Paul, he got invited to the 200th episode party, which, if I'm not mistaken, was the episode where Homer becomes the garbage man for Springfield. U2 was in the episode. Steve Martin was in the episode. And the party was at the House of Blues on Sunset. And so Paul's like, you want to go? And I'm like, okay. So here we are in the heart of Hollywood at the House of Blues. They've rented the whole place out. There was this pyramid of like pink sprinkled donuts on a table. You could just go and eat. They had these like women, like hostesses, walking around with were basically White Castle burgers, but they called them Krusty burgers that they would like give you. The news was there. There was some band that Matt had brought in. I forget who the band was to play. Phil Hartman.
Wow.
I'm not mistaken, I think this was Phil Hartman's last live appearance, because I remember shortly after that party hearing about him dying on the radio and going into Clay's office and being like, oh my God, did you hear about Phil Hartman? He's like, no. And I had just seen him like 2 weeks prior doing his whole Troy McClure bit and just killing and owning the entire room. And I just remember just buzzing at all of it, because I was, again, selling shoes weeks earlier, and not weeks, but like months earlier. I'd just been selling shoes in Seattle, Washington, and now I was at a Simpson. I was a huge fan of Simpsons. I to this day, I still believe that seasons 3 through 6, it was the greatest television show in history. It was the best written television show in history. So I was just like, oh my God, I'm at the Simpsons party, and there's all these people, and there's Phil Hartman and donuts and Krusty Burgers. And I went outside because it was all getting to be a bit much for me. And I went outside into the parking lot. I looked up, and on Sunset Boulevard, there was a huge King of the Hill billboard. And it wasn't just a billboard. Hank's arm was on like a motor, and he was holding a spatula, and it was moving up and down like he was flipping a burger or something. And the coals, like the burners for his propane grill, were glowed, like they had lights on the. And I was just looking at it, and it just suddenly occurred to me that I worked on that show. I worked on a show that required or merited a extremely fancy and expensive looking billboard on one of the most famous streets in the United States of America. And I just stood, I don't know how long I was standing there with my mouth open staring at it. But that was the moment I finally realized that, like, if there was ever a I made it moment, it was probably there. And it happened 2 weeks into my career. So I got, again, stupidly lucky. Like, I get the chills sometimes when I think about how lucky I got, and that if one tiny thing went differently, none of this would have happened. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you.
Well, there's one thing I wanted to circle. Well, there's a couple things I want to circle back to. excuse me. You had mentioned him by name a couple times, but Paul is. I know you said in the '90s he was 60. Is he still around by chance, or
Unfortunately, now he passed away a couple of years ago. His name was Paul
okay?
Gruel. He was my mentor. I would
Hmm.
not be in the animation industry if it weren't for him. I would not have the life I have if it weren't for him. And yeah, I think it was about, I want to say 2016, 2015, he
Hmm.
passed away. Because I remember I was at Titmouse Studios where I am now, and a friend of mine who had worked with him on something else, and he told me I had lost touch with Paul a little bit. He had moved back to Seattle, but he was in his 80s.
Hmm.
His health wasn't great when I knew him, and then 20, so when my friend told me, it wasn't a huge surprise, but
Yeah.
I try to I try to help younger artists out as much as I can,
Hmm.
just in that sort of pay it
Pay it
forward
forward.
kind of,
Yeah.
because I wouldn't be where I am, and I've known guys in this industry who try to discourage people from getting into it to keep the competition down or whatever BS reason they give, but that's just never been my style. And like I said, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Paul really, really helping me out, like as much or more than probably anybody in my life ever has. So
Hmm.
yeah, he's the guy that is worth mentioning. Definitely one of the most important people I've ever known in my life. So,
That's
and
really
again, like I
cool.
said, his resume is just, it's my childhood. It's Super Friends, Scooby Doo. I didn't really watch GI Joe, but I know a lot of people that when I told them that my mentor worked on GI Joe, they got very excited. um, but yeah,
Yeah, that's really cool, man. And we like to do it, and we'll do this with your friend Ian as well. But what's your favorite story about Paul, man? I mean, when you sit back and you think about him, does one come to mind, or if you could
uh,
encapsulate him in one story, what story would you pick?
I think that night at the Simpsons party, because to
Mhm.
him, he'd been doing this for a long time. To him, it was like, oh yeah, another one of these. You want to come? And I was just like,
Mhm.
sure. So to me, it was just like, oh my God. And to him, it's just like the 50th one of these he'd been to or something at that point. But yeah, I think that was like I said, that him inviting me to that party, it was the thing that gave me the realization. But most of the stories with him were when he was just living upstairs from me, and I would just go up to his apartment and we would hang out. And he had this idea for an animated project that he wanted to pitch years ago, and he had decided that I'd rather do it as a comic.
Mhm.
And so I remember sitting down with him and taking like storyboards he had done, and we would just sit down, and I'd be like, well, see, in comics, since the time doesn't actually exist in the comic, like in animation, every framing is exactly the same, and the time is real. Like if a character is going to move from here to there quickly, you see it happen quickly. If you want to convey that in comics, you have to arrange the panels in such a way that make people feel like they're moving quickly from one panel to another. You have to manipulate them visually. So I'm teaching him all this stuff, and then he's teaching me about like storyboard cleanups and revisions, all this stuff. So we were just sharing ideas back and forth.
Mhm.
But I remember working on this project with him. It was science fiction, anthropomorphic animal stuff. It was real fun. It was because I had always done like superhero stuff when I was a kid. So this type, it was like very different for me. And I brought two things to the party for him is that one, just a fundamental knowledge of comic books, which I had learned from Scott McCloud and Will Eisner, like everybody else my age.
Mhm.
And also, there was a game that he created in the comic that was played with giant robots on a spinning centrifugal ice rink, and it was basically hockey with
Mhm.
and the net. I remember it was cool because the nets were back to back, so you had to like skate around this ring like in the game Halo to get to the other side to
Yeah.
score. And it spun because it was in space. It was zero gravity, but it spun like in 2001 and created gravity through centrifugal force. And he had it all worked out, but he didn't know anything about hockey. And I used to play hockey when I was a kid, and I just grew up being a fan of it. So I brought a fundamental knowledge of how hockey works and how comics work. And so for me, and it was because it was the first time that I ever had that kind of collaborative relationship with another artist.
Mhm.
I was 25 at the time, and art had always been this very isolated thing for me because I had an uncle who was an artist. Like he was not a professional artist, but he was a guy that was very influential because he was like the only person in my life that would tell me when something I drew sucked. Everybody else was like, "Yeah, it's the best thing I've ever seen." And he's like, "That head's too big," or "You need to learn foreshortening," whatever. He was always the guy that was honest with me. but this was the first time I ever like collaborated on a project with another artist, and it was
Mhm.
really exciting for me. Even though it never went anywhere, I didn't kind of really care. But that was kind of even more so, I think, than getting into the industry or him helping me get in the industry. It was that because that was the stepping stone into me thinking, oh, I could actually do this. And he was telling me, and I even told him like I can't do animation. He's like, you can totally do animation
Yeah.
because it's not that special. He was always like, trust me. He goes, yeah. He goes, I've seen guys who have had 20-year long careers that don't draw as well as you now. So just
Mhm.
relax. I was just like, so yeah, him making me believe that I could actually do it. And like I said, through collaborating, and sometimes he'd help me, or he'd let me help him out on some of the freelance jobs that he would get
Yeah.
on like shows and stuff. From he had friends down in LA, and like I said, there weren't that many people in the like good people were at a premium, so he was getting freelance stuff from people he knew here when he was in Seattle. They would like just
Mhm.
FedEx him scripts and stuff, and he would FedEx boards back and so he and when he would be working on them, he would even like let me clean up a couple of panels and just get hands on. And that was really important. That was a big one for me. It was just like feeling like I was doing it, and that was
Mhm.
and that I could do it. And that was a big one. He gave me confidence basically. He made it possible for me to even pursue this as a career, to even think about pursuing this as a career.
That's really cool, man. And like I said, it's a fascinating thing because like you said, it's a very isolated, and I've heard that term so many times. It's a very isolated profession. Obviously, you guys are with COVID. It's probably a little bit. Well, it's not probably, but since COVID, it's probably been a lot different because there's a lot more people working at home. It's not
Mm-hmm.
as collaborative in a sense. Like it's easier to like you did with Clay, where you popped in. I think you should rub his back. What do you think? Yeah, just do it.
Yeah.
It's a little bit harder to be call. Hey, can I do this? Can I do that? You're on a Zoom call every once in a while, so the collaborative effort's a little bit easier to kind of reel in or to highlight, I guess, if you're all in the same area. So to hear that he took so much time with you, so patient, he really showed you and he gave you the confidence. So like I said, I love hearing stories like this. And there's one thing I wanted to circle back to because it's come up a couple times, not only here that you've mentioned it, but comic books, but it's also came up with almost every single artist I've had on from King of the Hill. It's like I wanted to do comics. I think Alan said it. There was a
Mm-hmm.
couple other people that said I wanted to do comics, and I kind of, not fell into animation in a bad way, but I kind of got shown this thing that I'm in doing now. And I draw that correlation with Disney. I had a few Disney artists on last year, and almost every single one that I talked to, they're like, I never wanted to animate. I wanted to do the National Geographic, like the illustrations on the animals, like the big
Mm-hmm.
games, the elephants, stuff like that. And that was almost exclusively Disney. I never heard that with Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon artists. They all want to do cartoony stuff like Peanuts and shit. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying Peanuts are shit because I'm a huge Peanuts fan. I got them tattooed on my hands. I've got them tattooed. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
huge, 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 huge Peanuts fan. But that side really wanted to do the super, super zany, weird, cartoony shit. And is that like I don't want to say is that like a prerequisite because there's like no prerequisites to I'm gonna do comics, then I'm gonna get into King of the Hill. But is there a lot more people that you've come into contact with that have worked on King of the Hill that had that same kind of I want to do comics and then you kind of fell into animation for King of the Hill?
I don't know what the numbers are. I do remember like that was a thing that Alan and I, when as soon as we met, like
Mhm.
that was a thing that we really kind of came to like it's like ooh it's like we saw each other. It's like comics
Yeah.
and that was comics were a big part of it. Like we used to do my buddy Dusty Abel, who used to work in comics and then moved over to animation. Really phenomenally talented artist. You might have he's been doing these things the last couple of years of like he'll do these drawings that have like hundreds of characters on them, and it's like he
Mhm.
did like every single character that was in Star Trek the original series. And if I remember correctly, he did that one, and then Paramount reached out to him and were like, "Hey, it's the Star Trek's 50th anniversary. Can we license this from you?" And he's like,
Oh, that's
"Yes."
so
And then it
cool.
just sort of took up. But Dusty's this insane like. He's like I always call him a professional fanboy because all of his art is
Ha!
like things that
That's
he loved
awesome.
as a kid. And Dusty used to spearhead this like weekly trip to the comic book store in Burbank. It's called House of Secrets, and that was where the entire animation industry, like we used to see Bruce Timm there, and Patton Oswalt, the comedian, used to get his,
Yeah.
his comics there. I run into him. a lot, and so it was the place to go. And we used to go every Wednesday for years and years, and we would get comics, and then we would go to this Mexican restaurant for lunch, and then they had like the lunch buffet, and then we take the 2 hour lunch and then go back to work. I'll be honest with you, I don't know how we ever got that show on the air. To be honest, it's like it's a mystery to me after all these years. Um, but so yeah, comics were always a big part, and there were always the guys, like I said, like Alan, where when we met, we sort of um, we bonded over that we both had these like the same kind of love. And like I said, my buddy Dusty was just a huge, massive comic nerd, just absolutely fanatical for it. So and we would compare what our favorite books were from the day, and we would spend half the day talking about stuff.
Yeah.
But about comics. But yeah, it was very common. We had plenty of people who also just wanted to do animation. I feel like there were with King and Hill, there were different camps, and guys like Alan and I who had always sort of pushed ourselves to do more realistic, sort of superhero, more realistic human proportions. Uh, we kind of felt, at least for me, I felt more comfortable doing King and Hill because it was more realistic human proportions versus like The Simpsons, where Bart's what, like 2.5 heads high, and they have kind of the noodly arms, and they're just made up of spheres and tubes, and which presents its own, obviously challenge. Believe me, I'm not saying The Simpsons is an easy show to work on. It's just different. And so there were people, like me, who was like, they just felt more comfortable at King of Hill. And there were the people who always wanted to do the animation stuff, who were better at The Simpsons or shows like that. And I remember we would have people leave sometimes to go to like a Nickelodeon show. And at the
Mhm.
time when I was new, I'd be like, why is he leaving this sweet job to go work on some stupid kids Nickelodeon show? And it's because that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to
Mhm.
do kids stuff, oriented stuff, cartoony, over the top, crazy stuff like that. And we had the group of guys who always wanted to be working on Batman or Superman or whatever, like the adventure, the action adventure superhero type stuff. I remember we had a guy for years who wanted to, who when he was on our show, he was a little annoying because he just wanted to be on The Simpsons, and we all
Mhm.
got this impression, it's like, oh well, hey, if you don't want to be here, dude, there's the door, and he eventually did make it on The Simpsons, and he was a great guy. He was a good friend of mine, but he rubbed some people the wrong way with his mania
Yeah.
for wanting to work on The Simpsons. Um, but I was like, hey, everybody's got their thing, and
Mhm.
if that they want to do, and that's all there is to it. And then like my boss right now, Anthony Leoy, who I believe has been a guest on your show,
Uh-huh.
uh, he was he was one of our top directors. He was like one of the like right out of the gate, from his first show that he directed, they were like, oh great, this guy's raising the bar for everybody else. But he left to go work on Avatar: The Last Airbender, which
Mhm.
seemed like a weird choice, but it was a challenge for him. It was a new thing that he's like, yeah, I want to do this. I've been doing this for this long. Now I want to go do this. It's like a challenge. It's like a new thing. So it happened. We would get, because there were people that would just be like, I'm going to hang on to this job forever. And then there were the other people who would get itchy and want to go and do something else. And we had people that went to my buddy Chuck Austin. He was a board artist when I started. Eventually went on to be an assistant director on the show. He left to write comics for years and made a very big name for himself doing so. He
Mhm.
wrote Superman and X-Men. He wrote like every top book you could imagine for the two big studios. And then eventually he came back to animation. But, it was just that was the thing he wanted to do at that time, and he went and did it. So, yeah, everybody, I think it's just when you have a creative career, sometimes you want challenge, you want new challenges, you want to do things, and a lot of people I know, like myself included, are always working on our own things, um, because that's the kind of the stuff that fuels you a little bit more creatively. Things that you get to mold, and it's all you, and you don't have to answer to anybody else to do it. And I think it's important to have that. I mean, I know some people don't have that, and some people want it, but they don't have the time because they have kids
Mhm.
or families, or their job is just too demanding or whatever. But teach their own. And for me, I like to work on my own stuff and to stay kind of creatively stimulated and motivated. But yeah,
Absolutely.
everybody has their thing that they want to be doing, and some people like Disney feature is the thing. Um, like we had a guy that worked on the show for a while that he was a casualty of Disney basically canning their entire 2D, you know, department in the, I guess in the early 2000s, whenever it was,
Hmm.
like after Home on the Range or whatever that movie was. And it was rough on him because he had started on Pocahontas, I think. And he
Oof.
told me once that when he signed his contract, the guy said, "Congratulations, this is the last job you'll ever have," because they were used to, the old men from back in the Snow White days that were like 90 and still at Disney, and that
Yeah.
that was the culture, and that's what they sold to this guy. And then they took it away from him, and I was like, God, I can only imagine what that must have felt like for him. And I'm pretty sure he landed square. He was a super talented dude, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm sure he landed on his feet. But it's just, it's like, you get to work on this kid show over here, or you get to work on a movie that is surely going to be a beloved classic for generations to
Hmm.
come.
Yeah.
Take your um, and he did work on movies that have become beloved classics for generations. So I guess at least he got that. But and people would be like, I don't know why he's so upset. King of Hill's a great show. I'm like, well, yeah, but if it's not what he wants to do, it's not what he wants to do. And it's not for me to say, it's not for you to say, it's for nobody else to say what somebody wants to do and what somebody doesn't want to do. And we
Absolutely.
used to kind of get put through the ringer a little bit about the style of the show of King of the Hill
Mhm.
because it was a little wonky. That was Mike Judge's style, and we were a hell of a lot cleaner and smoother than Beavis and Butthead. But
Mhm.
I was just like, I just accepted the fact this is the style of the show. Deal with it. and it wasn't an easy show to work on. Like we did, you know, shows like, and I'm not besmirching Family Guy by any stretch of the imagination because I worked on the Cleveland show, but the characters were like, here's the model of the character, and if they're nodding or looking down, you just tilt their head or whatever. But on King of the Hill, you had to like move their head in 3 dimensions, and you'd have to
Mhm.
see the top of Hank's head, and his glasses had to tilt down, and you had to do all that stuff, and it was a lot more sophisticated, I think, than people probably gave it credit for. And I can say that because I'm the one that had to do it and actually like draw it. We had guys, my buddy Randy, his brother was a sculptor, and he had made maquettes of some of the characters, like busts
Mhm.
of Hank and Bobby and Peggy, because the characters were so hard to draw from different angles that his brother made these like really amazing maquettes, and Randy would keep them in his desk. So if he needed to draw Bobby from a certain angle, he would just pick it up and just tilt it, and then just draw as he saw it. And everybody wanted one. Everybody was like, "Oh my God, how do I get one of those things?" So yeah, it was challenging for that reason.
Was was there any? So I love talking characters because obviously the last couple years, probably last year or so, I've really been fascinated with backgrounds. I find,
Mm.
and ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for saying this again, but I find world building just so fascinating. Right? There's something about, like, I love the characters. I love seeing people draw characters, but it's like I said, it's just something about you take these characters and you put them in a place, and then they're inhabiting what's going on, right? So they're not only are they you guys building the characters are building the world that's around them because they have to interact with houses, with neighbors, with malls, with all this other crazy shit. So, like I said, I just find them beautiful. I find them fascinating. But when we're talking characters in particular, and you said that these guys were, hard to draw at different angles. Was there
Mhm.
anyone specifically for you? I know you can't talk for everybody else, but was there one or two characters that were extremely difficult to really nail down? Does any of them stick out in mind to you?
The character that I remember specifically giving the most people the most trouble was
Mhm.
Cotton,
Yeah,
and it's because Cotton,
makes sense.
there was a tendency that people had, some people, to give Cotton little person proportions. They would
Hmm.
draw him short torsoed, and they would put his knees halfway up his legs. And I'm
Yeah.
like, no, if Cotton's still at his knees, he'd be like 6'2" or 6'3". So the things that were difficult about him, and the way I used to, because little known fact, unless you know me, then it's a very well known fact, is that on the season 2 DVD for King of the Hill, I did a segment called the Arlen School of Drawing, where I basically sort of did like an instruction on here's how you draw the characters.
Hmm.
Um, and Clay Hall, my first director, he had recommended me to Greg Daniels because Greg told Clay, he goes, "Hey, I want to do this," and Clay, God bless him, recommended me to do it, and I did. So one of the advice I gave for Cotton, because I did all the main characters, but I included Cotton specifically because the way I described him and the way I used to tell people all the time is that on my model pack for Cotton, I drew legs on him that went down to where his feet would be. and I kept his feet, where they are, just below his knees. But I drew out his legs all the way to the bottom and said, "This is how tall Cotton would be if he still had his shins."
Hmm.
So what I did was I said, "So imagine this guy standing in a hole up to his knees, and that's how you draw Cotton." And
Mm.
I would tell a lot of people that. So keep that in mind. Always keep that in mind. Cotton's 6'2". He just, at least he would be anyway.
Yeah.
Draw him as a guy who's 6'2", but standing in a hole up to his knees. And when he walks, he would swing way back and forth because he couldn't bend his legs. So his,
Penguin.
his legs would
Yeah.
his legs would stay perfectly straight. There was a very specific walk cycle for Cotton. He took these big swinging steps, and his body swung way back and forth one direction to the other. So he was the guy. And I remember there were a few times where I had a couple directors that would give me somebody else's scenes back and be like, "Can you redraw Cotton?"
Hmm.
Because I did sort of, I wouldn't say I had like the secret sauce when it came to Cotton. I just understood the character mechanically, how he worked. And I think it's probably because I probably drew him wrong once and the director told me I did. And I've always been one of those people that I
It'll
tend
never happen again.
I try to
Yeah.
be the person who only makes a mistake once. And I
Hmm.
usually only need to be told, "Oh, you screwed this up," and I'll be like, "Oh, okay." Then I start breaking him down like forensically on how to draw Cotton. But yeah, he was the character I think that was just, he was the one that gave the most people the most trouble just because of his proportions and the mechanics of him moving. But acting wise, he was the easiest because he was just always angry.
He's so
Um,
great. He's
I
such
love
a fun
Cotton.
character.
I love Cotton because Cotton is such a. We had no two-dimensional characters on the show, and God bless our writers. Our writers were so unbelievable, and I was lucky enough in my career that I got to work more closely with the writers and get to know them than most of the artists
Hmm.
because of the nature of the job that I did. And they were great people, and they loved the show, and they were passionate about the show, and they were passionate about the characters. And the thing I loved about Cotton and everybody else is that none of them were just, "Oh, that's the guy who's like this." Cotton had a moment where it was like the first time he ever gave Hank a compliment. And he told Hank, he goes, "You're a better daddy than I ever was." And Hank's like, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "You made Bobby. And all I did was make you." He was just like, it was this like backhanded compliment.
Yeah.
But he loved Bobby so much that because Hank made Bobby, that was like that was the thing that endeared Hank to Cotton, was
Hmm.
that Hank had made this kid who Cotton loved more than anything in the world.
Yeah.
And that was my favorite Cotton line of all time, when he told him that he was a better father than him because he made Bobby, and all I did was make you.
Well,
And
that's
just like,
it's funny that it's a backhanded compliment because when I think of Cotton, I told Alan, I think it was Alan, maybe it was Bill, I can't remember because of some of these chats have kind of like merged into one because they've been so close to one another.
mhm,
But I'm a huge fan of World War II and the history and everything because of Cotton, right?
mhm.
The little bit of things when you're going through through middle school, high school, elementary school, the greatest hits essentially of World War II. You hear about Normandy a little bit, you hear about Pearl Harbor a little bit, you hear about the two bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you hear a couple things, right? But it was like Cotton's talking about the shit that he went through, as a character. It like really, fascinated me in a sense where like I want to know more about like what this guy really went through because I wonder if that's possible. Because as a kid watching this, I'm like, I don't think it's possible to if your shins are blown off. I don't think you're getting your feet to your knees, and then
Yeah,
you don't have the internet really, so you kind of just have to go with
yeah.
whatever you hear. It might be real, it might be not, but it really instilled that fascination of World War II in me. And then whenever I think of Cotton Hill, though, I think of that episode where it's I can't remember what Buck did, but the Habitat for Humanity. So it's Christmas time. Jimmy Carter's in this episode,
Mhm.
and then so Jimmy Carter is literally playing peacekeeper negotiator, kind of like they did with the Iran Contra, whatever it was. But it was him going
It
back
was
and forth with
Israel and
Cotton.
Egypt. It was
Yeah,
Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. That was Carter's
yes.
big accomplishment.
Thank you. So it was so when I think about like I said, when I think about Cotton, there's two lines in particular. It's the one with Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter's like, "You hated a baby, hated the baby." He's like, "A baby." He's like, "Hated him." day one, he was like, he cried, all this other shit. And then it was just like, so if you had this mythical button or this magical button where you could blink him out of existence, would you push it? He's like, I guess not yet. And then he goes over to Hank and he's like, and he said that he's like, yeah, he wouldn't push the button yet. And going back and forth. So I think about that one. And then I can't remember the episode. I think it was probably the one where Hank finds out he's from New York, or he was born in New
Yeah.
York.
I think we negated, actually, did we negate that one? That's a different story. Continue. I'm going to get my
Oh, yeah.
facts straight here about that.
But it's it is that one, I think. But it's like they catch them all on the boat and shit like that.
Yeah,
And then
they're
you
going to go
hear
kill
Cotton.
Castro.
Yeah, he's like, all I wanted to do was kill Castro. And he's like, I know, Dad, I know. And then that's kind of like how they leave it.
Yeah, yeah.
So
We so we thought, and I don't know how much of this legend seeps out into the world beyond us, but at the end of season 10, we thought the show was being canceled
mhm.
because we used to get preempted for football a lot back when football was on. I guess it's still on Fox, but when we were on Fox, we used to get preempted by football all the time. So a show that was supposed to air wouldn't air, and then some genius at Fox apparently at some point realized, and I don't mean one of our guys. I mean like somebody at the network, some accountant in a
Yeah.
room somewhere realized, oh my God, we have so many episodes of King of the Hill just like backlogged from being preempted that if we only ordered 5 episodes in a season, we would have a whole season. Think of all the money we'd save. And someone's like promoted. And then they only ordered 5 episodes for season 10, which there were all of us were like, well, that's it for the show. We're done. And then everybody left. So we did the 5 episodes, and then everybody just scattered. Mostly the Family Guy. We had some guys go down to the Simpsons. All of the usual suspects.
Mhm.
Trying to remember if Bob's Burger was one of them. I know a lot of ex King of the Hill people ended up on Bob's Burgers. We're everywhere. We're like roaches. And I was the last artist on the show because I was the retake director.
Mhm.
And I had an assistant, and like a week before my last day, my assistant was let go. So it was me sitting alone in a studio. I was the last guy on. I was Jack and Rose as the Titanic was going down, and I was like, hold on, and I've been that guy a couple of times in my career. But it was a week before my what was supposed to be my last day, and my boss came in and she goes, I just got a call from Mark, who was the line producer over at Fox, and he goes, Fox just picked up season 11. And I was looking around and I was just like,
You
well, I'm
sure?
not going to do it by myself. And the last 3 seasons were a little weird because we had to change the way the show was done because we lost our entire crew and we had to like get like kind of a whole new crew. But we switched after all those years of doing layout. We switched from layout back to storyboards and
Mhm.
did that for the last 3 seasons. But it was weird. And so what had happened was is that what was going to be the last episode of season 10, they wrote the writers wrote this tag at the end of the episode that was going to wrap everything up.
Mhm.
And I think the animatic is on YouTube somewhere if someone's diligent enough to find it. And I think it was I'm trying to remember who did it. It was me and then somebody else. It's all so blurry. It was a long time ago. And this was even longer ago because this would have been like 2005 or six. And they had written this thing where it was the guys and they were all hanging out, and it was the classic, they were standing around at the fence drinking beer, and they were
Mhm.
talking about the weird year they had just had and all the weird things that had just happened in the year. And the insinuation was is that the previous 10 years had been 1 year of Arlen time. And
Mm.
at one point, and they were like, oh man, that time that this happened, and they were just referencing all these old shows. And Bill said, oh, and that time that we found out that Hank was born in New York and that Cotton was going to kill Castro. And Hank's like, how many times do I have to tell you, Bill, that didn't happen? That was a weird dream you had when you ate that burrito or something. Like it was and they wrote it off as like a fever dream that Bill had had. And I thought that was pretty funny, but it never aired because we didn't get canceled. This was supposed to be the wrap up, and we didn't get canceled, so that basically got scrapped. But
Do you
I
think it's
recently
canon?
found out, huh?
Do you think it's canon? If that would have played, or if they make a reference to that, does that completely negate that episode and it's no longer canon?
I don't know, because the thing is that there were a couple of times where canon got a little fuzzy, and the most
Uh-huh.
notable one was the Montana episode. It
Mm,
was called "A Rover Runs Through It," and the reason that was weird is because they wrote the episode where Peggy was going home to Montana, and it had been established that she was from Montana. That was a well-established fact.
mhm.
But it had also been well established that she went to West Arlen High when Hank went to Arlen High, and her mom also lived in Arlen, and her mom just looked like an older version of her with like a beehive and was a housewife. And then they wrote this whole script where they were like, her mom was this rancher who still lives in Montana and was mad that Peggy left, even
Mm,
though no one ever said anything about being mad that Luann's dad left to go work on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. But it was all these things. And all of us who were just the lowly artists were like, that's not how any of this happened. Like, we have all these seasons of canon. Like, you saw Peggy's mom in like season 1 or 2. It was the episode where Hank we found out Hank had
mono.
mono from kissing another
Yeah.
girl. Like, you see Peggy's mom living in Arlen, being a housewife, and they were like, oh no, we're ignoring that, and we're doing this now. And we were all kind of like really put off by that, because it was just, I'm like, this is your show, and I just felt like you don't really appreciate the history, the established history of the show. So it wasn't a bad episode. And also because Henry Winkler was in it, and Henry Winkler, who's notoriously the nicest human being who ever
Yeah.
lived, played this elevated sort of
Douche.
whole version of himself,
Yeah.
which I love. We had a couple guys. Randy Travis did that too. We had a couple of guys times where we had some guy who was like notoriously nice play this like in a douchebag version of themselves. So I liked it for that reason, but just the fact that it kind of just disregarded the established canon, we were all a little put out, I think, at the time by it. Um, the episode ended up looking amazing. The background artist had a field day doing all these beautiful Montana,
Mountainscapes and shit.
mountains.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that was all cool and everything, um, but yeah, the as far as the canon about whether or not Hank is actually from New York, I like to think that that's not a thing that happened.
Well, it's
It just
funny. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I'm just saying it just doesn't fit. Like, it doesn't fit Hank. Hank is Texas through and
Yeah,
through.
absolutely.
So
He's as Texas as the Cowboys, but it's funny until you broke that down, because I've seen the series so many times, five, six, seven times, somewhere around there. But until you broke that down, I never really put thought into. I forgot. Not that I've seen that mono episode, because I could literally go through. The chick that gave Hank mono is working at the Megalomart, and she's handing
yeah,
out coupons and shit, and that's how Peggy sees her.
yeah,
They unlock the file, and then I completely forgot. Like, I knew she was in Montana because they or Montana. She's from Montana because they make references to it through the entire series. And then you remember that mono episode, and like, well, she went to the rival school of Hank. Like,
yeah,
how can she be a Montana rancher? And I'm like, fuck. Until you broke it down, I'm like, God damn, I've been living a lie,
yeah.
Glenn, the entire time.
I think the thing that bothered us was that it felt to us like when they decided to do that, and it was like literally one misfire in 13 seasons. Because
Mhm.
I worked for every showrunner, and they were all great in their own way, and they all had very different styles. And I really liked and respected every showrunner we ever had, and I actually got to know most of them, um, and some of them better than others. And I feel like that was the one that comes to mind anyway. That was the one misfire in what was otherwise a very
Tight show.
carefully curated world.
Mhm.
Uh, and yeah, that was because I remember Hank used to almost make jokes that he married Peggy in spite of the fact that she was from Montana,
Yeah.
which was always kind of a running joke. But yeah, that was one that kind of bugged me a little, just a little bit. But like I said, the episode itself was funny, and like the way Hank thought he was like, and they were treating Hank like a city boy, like a city slicker, and he it just that drove him nuts
He's
because
a Land Rover guy.
he's Hank Hill,
Yeah.
and yeah, he did not like that at all.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time, man. And since we're talking episodes, I figure we talked a little bit about the about Good Hill Hunting, man. But so you had sent me a list, and you said I think you broke it down was like what was it? The funniest episode I worked on. This one had the best lines. I can't remember how you worded, but
Well, there's
um
two. Whenever somebody asks me what my favorite episode is, I have
mhm,
two answers. I have my favorite episode, which is "Won't You Pee My Neighbor,"
mhm.
and then the funniest episode we ever did, which was "The Buck Stops Here." And "Won't You Pee My Neighbor" was hilarious. In fact, I rewatched it recently, and there was a line that Hank had that I forgot about that I was laughing hysterically at. I was like, "Oh, good, this show still holds up." And it was Peggy was doing an impression of Khan, and then he goes, "That sounds more like Min." And then she, as Khan goes, "You leave my wife out of this, you stupid hillbilly." And he goes, "Oh my God, that is him." And he laughs. He goes, "I wish they would move." And I
Yeah,
just laughed so hard at that line. And it's Mike. It's Mike
yeah.
reading the line. I you remember the episode with Brad Pitt where Brad Pitt played Boomhauer's brother, Patch
Yes,
Boomhauer.
yes. Patch, yeah.
The tape of the table read was going around, and Brad Pitt was there, and Brad Pitt was murdering as Patch because he was really excited about doing it, and he had created, and apparently the whole thing was his idea. He had approached John Altschuler, our showrunner, and because Jennifer Aniston, he was still married to her, she had done
Mhm.
a voice the previous season, and Brad was a huge fan of the show, and he came to the record with her, and he approached John Altschuler and said, "Hey, I want to do the show, but I want to play Boomhauer's brother," because he had done Snatch and he had that great
Oh, such a great
Traveler.
movie too.
It's my favorite performance of his, and he wanted to do that because he loved like the talk, and he created his own vocabulary for Patch Boomhauer, and just absolutely destroyed at the table read. But the thing that I took away from the table read is listening to the because I wasn't there, but I was listening to the tape of it.
Mhm.
Mike, who's on a phone in Austin, Texas. So Mike is basically a speaker in the middle of a table, and he's on a telephone, 1,500 miles away in Austin. There's a scene in the show where Hank and goes to Boomhauer's house to confront him about how Boomhauer's trying to sabotage his brother's marriage,
Mhm.
and they get into a shouting match with each other. Same dude. Mike did it in both voices, yelling over himself over the phone, and I was listening to it, and I remember just the entire time like my entire world just became this tunnel, and I'm like, does everybody else understand this is one dude yelling at himself on a phone from 1,500 miles away? And that was the moment like I'd always really respected Mike
Mhm.
on a lot of levels, but especially his voice work and character work. But I had never heard anything like that before. I had never heard anything as impressive in the moment as him having an argument with himself in two different voices. I was completely blown away. But everybody else just remembered Brad Pitt was there.
Were
And
you
then
guys
that was
able to keep the recorders?
they exist somewhere, I'm sure. I mean,
Mhm.
this we had those old Sony push button tapes where the tape would pop up and we'd stick it
Oh,
in
the
there.
Walkmans, yeah.
Well, they weren't Walkmans. They were like they had the one speaker. They were the old
Mhm.
school recorders that had a
Oh,
handle on them. They were like
yeah.
this long. And the tape would pop up, it had one speaker on it. And that's what we used to listen to the track on.
Mhm.
Um, or I would have like if you had a stereo like a boombox stereo in your
Yeah.
cubicle with headphones, you would do that or whatever. But they were on cassette tapes at the time,
Mhm.
and we would watch the show on VHS. It was 1998, 1999. It was the late 90s, early 2000s. It was the technology that we had, and we didn't know any better. So I couldn't go back to that. But yeah, at the time, it was like, oh boy, I
This
get
is
my
high
own
tech.
VCR. Yeah, but no, I wish I still had that. Of course, I would have had to digitize it somehow because I don't have anything to play it on. But that was that, and yeah, that's the thing. Like so many of Hank's lines are funny because of the way Mike reads them.
Subtle humor, yeah.
Uh, it's just something about because he is that character.
Hmm.
If they tried to recast Hank and you found a guy who did a perfect impression of Mike doing Hank, he wouldn't have the timing. He
Yeah.
wouldn't have the essence of the character. It just wouldn't be as funny. And Mike was just hilarious when he did that character. There's just no two ways about it. And you could say that about every single actor on that show.
Hmm.
Pam Adlin was so Bobby Hill to her
So
very core that I'm like, and that's the thing that's in my head. It's like, because the only thing I know about the new, because they're bringing it back, it's
mhm.
been announced. It's no secret. The only thing I know about it is that they supposedly are aging everybody in real time, and that Bobby's
Mhm.
going to be in his early 20s. And my only concern was, is Pam going to still do Bobby as a 23-year-old? Because like no one else can do that character. It's Pam. It's like,
Yeah.
and I don't think anyone would accept anybody else doing that character. I don't know how they even would. Um, but yeah, it's whether it's Johnny Hardwick as Dale or whether it's,
It fucking better be. There's a
well,
few
it's
things
gonna
that
be
I
trust me, it's gonna be Johnny. It's gonna
oh,
absolutely.
100%. There's just like you don't, with the exception of the couple people that have passed away,
Well,
obviously,
there's an
you know,
elephant in the room that's going to need to be addressed. There's two elephants in the room that need to be addressed, and
yeah,
it's Lucky the Lamb, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. So I don't know what they do, and it sucks because like the one thing everybody, not the one thing, because there's been a couple things that everybody's kind of been talking about with the reboot. It's like everybody is afraid of them. They don't want to see recasting, and some people do want to see recasting as far as Brittany Murphy and
Yeah,
fuck,
Tom Petty.
Heartbreaker. Tom Petty. I
Tom
knew it was
Petty.
Tom. I was getting ready to say Tom Hart, but that's not it. But yeah, Tom Petty and Brittany Murphy. And then you've got another thing that everybody, because once they said they're aging it forward, the next thing was like, fuck man, we're gonna have a show without Lady Bird because obviously Lady Bird was already
But
old as
Lady
shit.
Bird would. Hopefully, they got a new dog. Lady Bird was on her way out
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the show.
I just hope she's everlasting. And the downside is like
There'll be later Lady Bird too.
version two. It's just like a
Yeah,
cybernetic dog at this
she's
point.
got another bloodhound.
Yeah, so it's like I really want to. I hope, and I don't have any doubt that they're not going to keep this. You don't, and I'm biased as fuck when it comes to this show because I've said it. I think this is a perfect show, with the exception of you just breaking my brain about Montana and West Arlen just a minute ago. And in my
That's what I'm here
opinion,
for.
I'm here to fuck shit up, guys.
Won't be the last time
No,
in this interview.
but no, it's like I think it's a perfect show. I don't think there's really any filler episodes. I think you guys progressed a story and you guys told a beautiful story over 12 seasons. You guys kept me hooked. I mean, I'm still talking about it now 20 fucking years later. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So it's something that's everlasting. It's been something that's been living rent free in my head since as early as I can remember. Like you
yeah.
guys
Well,
informed my teenage years and you guys continue to do that in my adult years too.
I think it's been said a million times, and I'll say it for the million and first time. Every single character on that show, everybody knows one or two or
Yes.
three or four or five of those characters. My
Mm-hmm.
dad is Hank Hill with a better sense of humor. Uh,
Really?
when I got the job, King of the Hill was the only animated show my dad had ever seen because I would
Mm-hmm.
go to the first two seasons when I was still living in Washington. I would go to their house on Sundays for dinner, and it was that was when it was Simpsons at 8, King of the Hill at 8:30, X Files at 9. It was probably the greatest lineup of television in the history of television for in the 1990s. And my dad hated The Simpsons because he just didn't get it.
Yeah.
But the King of the Hill would come on, and just there was something about it. And I remember it was the episode from season 1 where Bobby got hooked on smoking, and my dad used to be a smoker.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
man, when Bobby starts chewing on the patches and Peggy's holding him down, she goes, "Hank, go get a stick." My dad started laughing so hard, and I was surprised because I was surprised that my dad was laughing at a cartoon, and he just resonated with the characters. He resonated with Earl. He resonated with Hank because, like I said, he's totally Hank.
Mm-hmm.
That episode, "Racist Dog," where with Bernie Mac, God rest him,
Yes.
where Bernie Mac was a repairman who came over to fix the hot water
Hot water
heater,
tank. Yep.
and Lady Bird barked at him and attacked him, and then he accused Hank of being racist because dogs follow their owner's lead. And then you find out later that he wasn't. It wasn't because Bernie Mac was black. It was because he was a repairman that was fixing something that Hank couldn't fix. So Hank was super on edge about
Yeah.
that, and Lady Bird picked up on that. That's my dad. If there's a
He
thing
bit a
that
white
breaks,
man. He bit a white man. Look, I'm not
yeah,
racist.
yeah, exactly. My dad, if he can't fix something in his house and has to call a professional, he's failed as a man, and
Yeah.
it kills him. And I remember when that episode came out, I'm like, this is my dad. My dad does this. He can't stand when people come over to the house to fix things that he couldn't fix. He was a civil engineer in the Air Force. He's just used to being able to fix everything.
Mhm.
And I was just like, that's my dad with that episode. And to this day, my dad, I gave my dad like King of the Hill, like crew jackets,
Yeah.
and he always wears his to like Home Depot, and
Ah.
that's if you're gonna get noticed, if someone's gonna be like, "Hey, King of the Hill," it's gonna be at Home Depot.
God, I hope so.
And to this day, he still wears it, and he still gets compliments all the time. And he's like, "Well, my son used to work on the show." I'm like, "It's 15 years ago." I
Well,
guess
that's
14 years ago. Yeah.